I've been an artist for 20 odd years, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experiences going out to Helmand in February 2010 on Herrick 11, primarily based with the Green Howards 2nd Battalion, the Yorkshire Regiment. As an artist, I've covered a diversity of subjects from auction houses to Indian fishermen to the African diaspora in Scotland. However, never in all my years did I consider that one day I'd be drawing away in a pitched battle with the smoke, the dust, the blasts, the clatter of machine guns, and the sort of sounds going all around me. Would have been something similar that my father here would have experienced in Aden in the late 1950s. And before him, my grandfather in the trenches of the First World War. I knew a few of their letters and photos, but very few of their stories, really. In fact, 2 weeks after my father died, I found a letter written to a good friend of his, and obviously later returned. And in this letter, it talked about arriving in Aden, the camp, going out on patrol, the reasons he'd volunteered for a Bren gun, and even describing using that Bren gun in action for the first time. Basically all stuff I didn't know. And I resolved, strange as it might sound, to go and experience something very similar. And I thought by doing that, it might answer a few questions I was no longer able to ask. It took me over a year to organise this trip to Afghanistan. A friend of mine in the Royal Navy had found me the relevant contact details for the MOD. And eventually I was given the green light to go. I spent a weekend doing pre-deployment training, learning basics like getting in a helicopter, how maybe to get out of a minefield, hostage situations, and lots of battlefield medical drills, of course. If you can imagine arriving at Brize Norton at 3 in the morning, and for the first time in your life, totally in a military world. I met a guy at the Royal British Legion who gave me a good piece of advice. He said, "Jules, you'll be feeling nervous, you'll be out of your depth. I suggest you get drawing straight away. Before you know it, you'll begin to get a few results and relax." I thought it was a good piece of advice, and I took it. This drawing above here is one of the first sort of relative successes, and it was done under the faintest glimmer of light in a Hercules troop carrier. I remember seeing opposite the dark silhouettes of the troops as they nodded off, and vaguely able to discern the odd feature. And I made this series of drawings, and at the time I wondered, what was going through all the individual minds of the guys opposite. Some were seasoned campaigners, they'd done it all before. Others were heading off for the first time. Arriving in Afghanistan, 2 Yorks were based in a little camp called Camp Tombstone, inside the main Afghan camp, Camp Sherabak, and adjacent to Camp Battalion, which you would have all have heard of. Their special task was training and leading the Afghan army on operations, operational mentoring liaison team. And I spent the first few days around these bases. And it gave me a good opportunity to sort of catch up with myself, begin to understand where I was, the atmosphere, the context, and things like armoured vehicles and the details of uniforms. I was even told about the rank system by a sergeant major. So it was all a big learning curve. However, I realised it wasn't just a learning curve for me. One afternoon, I went to draw the sentries doing stag duties at the main gate. One sentry, it was his first stag duty. and his first tour to Afghanistan. He was very nervous. And at one point, an Afghan vehicle approached the gate and crossed a very strict no crossing line. And I remember, terrified, he turned to me and said, "What do I do?" And it was a good question. At this time, a large operation was launched called Operation Mushtarak, meaning together. And it involved 15,000 British, American and Afghan troops. I attended the eve of battle speech given by the brigade commander, James Cowan, originally of the Black Watch. He was piped in to give his eve of battle speech, and I remember listening to the pipes with the distant blue mountains of Afghanistan, thinking how evocative it was. And it was like a strange symbolic echo to the past, and perhaps previous British involvements in Afghanistan. With this operation launched, inevitably there was a lot of activity down on the flight line, helicopters coming and going, and I spent many hours down there making drawings. This one focuses on a Chinook as a column of troops clambers aboard, as if being swallowed by a strange beast that is then going to take off and disappear beyond the sand and the storm into the blue sky. It held a sort of abstract quality to me, because up till then I'd only been in the main bases, and I wanted to sort of see beyond the wire, what was outside. Eventually I did clamber aboard a helicopter. I was pulled beside just before I clambered aboard and shown an important lesson: how to use and fire the standard British rifle if the worst came to the worst. Imagine, if you can, beyond that wire, the blue skies, the distant blue mountains, the haze in the air, and in the middle ground, a fertile green valley through which flows a river. And in the foreground, a column of troops wends its way up to the patrol base. An officer with an interpreter speak to a local, and there's a fruit seller and a donkey. This stunning setting was what I found heading beyond the wire. Of course, this is a lithograph done after the artist James Atkinson, who accompanied the first British expedition to Afghanistan in 1839. Except this is exactly what I found. And if you were to replace the elephant and the camel with an armoured vehicle, or the red tunics with desert fatigues, everything would remain the same. Now, how did I prepare for my trip to Afghanistan? Beyond reading a couple of books and seeing newspaper articles, there wasn't much preparation I could do. Beyond sharpening up my drawing skills, I decided I'd never been in a theatre of war before, so it was best not to go with too many preconceived ideas of what I should do. The idea was to try and be objective as possible, and to be honest, I wasn't interested in the rights or wrongs of the war or the politics. My objective was to experience and document in a series of drawings British troops on operations. One preparation I did make was to acquire an assault vest that went over my body armour, this green camouflage item. We acquired this with the help of a sergeant from the Royal Anglian Regiment, for inside it had large pockets to put my sketch pads. And on the outside, where one would usually have rifle magazines, as you can see, I could put my pens and brushes, pencils, etc. I'd had enough common sense to realise that if I needed to move abruptly, quickly, everything was on me. and I could just move. I didn't have to fumble around with a bag at my feet. It actually came in useful at the end of my trip. I was stuck in Kandahar for 3 days. And to break up the tedium of that base, the cookhouse was open 3 times a day for an hour. Inevitably, I was paranoid about losing my drawings at this point. So, 3 times a day, you were not allowed a bag in the cookhouse. I went through this strange ritual of taking my drawings from a bag and putting them inside this assault vest. And in I wandered, this sort of bulked out figure. I received quite a few strange looks as this sort of strange camouflage Michelin man wandered in. This is an example of a fairly early drawing. And it was done in forward operating base Shortcut, headquarters of the Grenadier Guards battle group. I'd just been off my first helicopter ride, and a couple of lads told me another one was coming in if I wanted to get some drawings done. I readied myself, and as it dropped out of the sky, but no one had told me about the downdraft and the inevitable wall of dust that would hit you and the need to turn and duck. Quite literally, I was physically picked up and blown around the corner of a compound. My sketch pad flew off in one direction, my pen in another, and I ripped my drawing hand badly in the process. Retrieving my sketch pad, in fact, this drawing was done while the helicopter was on the ground. And although lacking certain details, I think it sort of captures very much the essence of the difficulties for an artist of working in that sort of environment. When you can see here is the sort of ripped page from where it was blown around the corner, and a blood stain up in the right-hand corner. And all across the page is the sort of dust of Afghanistan. So I think, for me anyway, it captures and is a sort of good working example of the rigours of being in Afghanistan. As an artist, to get on in Afghanistan, you had to join in with the banter of the troops. And I enjoyed that. It worked in 2 different ways. Often you'll be working away and a couple of British troops would wander up. And bear in mind the sort of macho world. They come and watch you for a while. Then one would turn, look you in the eye and say, "That's rubbish, mate. My 3-year-old daughter could do better than that." And I realised what was going on here was, it didn't really matter whether they liked the drawing or not. They were checking you out, sizing you up, and seeing how precious you were going to be. So joining in the banter, I'd look at them and say, "You're right, mate, but it's not bad for an amateur," or "You finish it off," or something like that. To give you an idea of the power of painting and drawing and its ability to transcend barriers, I spent a lot of time at the main gates here, drawing the bazaar opposite and the patrols coming in and out. And they were guarded by the Afghan army. And unused to their idea of a Western artist, they found it miraculous that, as if by magic, a portrait of their friend would appear on a blank piece of paper. Although language was limited to salam or tashakkur, they would often laugh and watch as I drew, and every mark would be accompanied by "good" or "no good." So I enjoyed my time with them. I moved on to a little patrol base called PB Chile in the Nadiali district. Been decided to head out on a foot patrol a couple of hours later. And having a couple of hours to spare, I climbed up the nearest sangha or watchtower and made a drawing. It was therapeutic, really, this drawing, because feeling a bit nervous gave me something positive to think about and channel my thoughts to. In fact, this is a painting made from that original drawing. And it was a stunning landscape In fact, it was a biblical scene. It was like being in another time, in another age, with the shepherd and his flock in the near ground, and in the distance, the compounds, and little flashes of colour as women walked past in their bukaras. As an extreme contrast to this was the darkness of the Sangha and the silhouette or the jimpi or the general purpose machine gun in the near ground, with all, of course, its dark and sinister connotations. Three months earlier, 5 Grenadier Guards and Royal Military Police had been killed by a rogue Afghan at a little base just down the road. Equally, 2 days before, an IED had been found. So heading out on the foot patrol, the danger element was very real. Every precaution was taken, really. I was told to stick with the man in front, and whatever happened, just to stay with him. And as we headed out on foot patrol, it was the first time that I've ever learnt to draw and walk at the same time, let alone closely following his footsteps, only too aware to the possibility of IEDs. This is an example of one of those drawings done on the move. And of course, it's very minimal, you could say. However, it's amazing how a drawing like this can convey a lot of information and can be used later on for a painting. We walked across fields, through compounds, down dusty alleyways. Locals would wander out to watch us by. Children would shout salam. And it was fabulous, really, to actually be walking in the landscape of Afghanistan. It was like walking in a different age and time, and to feel the dust. I've put this painting here to show you how this figure is connected to the previous drawing. And really to demonstrate how a final sort of composition might include 3 or 4 drawings put together. And of course, back in the studio, you have time to mix up colour as you wish, and generally create the composition that befits the dialogue you're trying to communicate. Helmand at this point was full of extremes. One minute you were walking in this stunning landscape, the next you're at a repatriation ceremony. There was a procedure called Operation Minimise, which occurred when there was a severe casualty or fatality. This procedure, little signs would go up all around the bases informing you it was on, and all communications with the outside world would cease until the next of kin had been informed. To give you an idea, this was pretty much going on all day, every day. I got on very well with a Sergeant Major from the 2 Yorks, and he showed me a Jackal armoured vehicle that had been blown up by an IED a few days before. Half of it had been found over a compound wall. In fact, a very good friend of that Sergeant Major had been killed in that blast, and inevitably he was still very raw. I did a drawing of that Sergeant Major, and strangely he insisted in sitting in a similar Jackal armoured vehicle as a backdrop. I moved further north up to a place called Musa Qala. It was the headquarters of the Household Cavalry Battle Group. And the DC, the district centre, had been a thriving hotel. I stayed on the 2nd floor for 2 nights. Except this hotel now was the sort of battered remains, burnt out remains of a building. Clear plastic was used for the windows. and the austere concrete interior was broken up with the odd bunk bed, dust, and Taliban graffiti. Up on the roof, I spent hours by the observation post, and it commanded fantastic views along the wadi and into the mountains in the beginning of the Hindu Kush. In fact, this is a little watercolour study made up there, which looks north across the bazaar and up towards Mount Musa Qala, or Mount Doom it was called by the troops. And here is the wadi wending its way down south. Now you could say these landscapes have an analogy to war artists of the past, where artists were required not just to document military endeavour and celebrated victories, but were required in a more sort of practical way to record the topography, the lay of the land, and enemy positions. And this was even required into the First World War, where artists such as Paul Mays, where cameras were very bulky and tricky to maneuver through the trenches, and he would crawl along and make notations to head back to, with vital information to head back to HQ. Now opposite the other side of the wadi was Roshan Tower, which was a Russian telecommunications center. Again, it was a stunning landscape. In fact, this is a 10-foot painting made from a similar watercolor to the previous one. Now you could say, why didn't I just take some photographs? It'd be a lot easier and I could just have done with it. However, in my view, I think painting and drawing has a sort of immediacy. And I think we're so inundated and surrounded by photography and moving footage. It's on our mobile phones, laptops, television, magazines, it's everywhere. And I think we're so bombarded by it these days that we almost see this graphic footage and straight away it's gone, it's forgotten as soon as we've seen it. And I think painting and drawing really has an innate human quality to it. And it has a tangible physicality and expression. I think it's time-honoured and it speaks to us in this timeless and direct manner. And I believe personally, I'm biased of course, but it provokes a deeper thought process. I've always been very intrigued by the Afghans themselves. Possibly I romanticise the Mujahideen fighting the Russians as freedom fighters, but nonetheless I'm still fascinated by them, so at every point I had, I would make some studies of them. These were two Pashtuns drawn at the gates to the forward operating base Shortcut. And I was very intrigued by them in their turbans and their long robes. And their faces were inscrutable. I remember thinking, I couldn't work them out. Were they friend or foe? Once a week, a large market took place in the wadi at Musa Qala. Hundreds of people would wander in from the surrounding villages and compounds, here crossing the wadi to the market in the middle. And they would meet up to trade in textiles, carpets, livestock, or even just to meet up. It was a fabulous, colourful spectacle and a vibrant scene, and a sort of peaceful respite for everyone, however temporary, from the ravages and consequences of 30 years of war. As an opposite, on the night of the 19th of February 2010, Corporal Dransfield put his kit together in a rather unorthodox but nonetheless well-rehearsed manner. Similarly, throughout the base, similar preparations were made. It had been decided to head off on operation at dawn. And throughout the base, blood groups were taken, rounds counted, and an air of anticipation and excitement pervaded. At dawn, I headed off with a fire support group from the household cavalry in a column of Mastiff armoured vehicles. We bumped and jolted our way across the terrain to a pre-designated point, known affectionately as Nipple Hill. We were to await the arrival of a foot patrol further down in the valley and to support them as they cleared compounds which were a well-known Taliban area. This, in fact, is a little drawing made of the FOO on the vehicle, the forward observation officer, making his report with Nipple Hill in the distance. As the sun began to rise and the haze cleared, various insurgent activity was spotted, and a javelin missile was set up on the vehicle. And it was always said with a wry smile that the price of one javelin missile equated to the price of a Porsche 911. The foot patrol was spotted, and as it came over a rise, unbeknown to the insurgents on the other side, effectively it was a catalyst and all hell was let loose. I suddenly found myself in amidst a frenetic battle which could best be described as a sort of organised chaos. I had to seize the moment and scroll down as much information as quickly as I could. I didn't have time to consider whether it was any good or not. Just to scroll down a few marks would suffice. In fact, resorting to the sort of stick men of my youth. This is a painting made from that previous drawing, and it's actually was acquired by the National Army Museum, this one. And very much it's about, as the column of troops race across the open ground with the protection of the smoke, it struck me in the muted landscape that it was like a sort of abstract red brushstroke across the landscape. Equally, it was like a veil or a metaphor for protection, with connotations of blood, and of course reflected, as you can see in some of these paintings around the room, the red tunics of uniforms from a different era and different time. Possibly in the 19th century, a patrol had headed across that very same spot, conducting a very similar operation. The battle raged on, and sitting on the top of a Mastiff armoured vehicle, I had a sort of old-fashioned general's view of the sort of battleground. And having never been in such circumstances, it was a really surreal thing. I thought I was in a film set or watching a sort of Sunday matinee. I didn't have time for, so frenetic was it all, I didn't have time for any fear. That only sort of kicked in later when I considered all the possibilities. This is another painting owned by the National Army Museum. And effectively it's made from a few drawings done at the time. And I've tried to keep the simplicity to those drawings. It's not about so much absolute detail as trying to keep the energy and convey the atmosphere of that situation. I sat on the vehicle with the gunner, the Squadron Corporal Major Sean Fry from the Household Cavalry, and he was firing at this tree line. In the tree line with the Taliban. And in the middle ground, the foot patrol raced from one compound to clear this compound. In fact, we were actually fired at, and I had to duck below, closely followed by the gunner here. And I remember as he ducked down beside me, he had a vast grin on his face. And I remember thinking, how bizarre, as if to say what fun he was having. Equally, I remember looking out through the back doors of the vehicle that were open. And in the distance were blue mountains like this. And in the near ground, a nomadic encampment with camels and goats, a paradise scene, and a paradox to the all-encompassing sounds of battle going on all around us. The battle raged for about 3¼ hours. Eventually we withdrew. And as we moved away, a blast thought to be an IED went off beside our vehicle, and we were violently pitched to the right. And I remember being strapped in the seat in the back, as if all the bones in one body had been jarred and thrown. News came in directly that another vehicle had hit an IED, and it was an open-top vehicle, and everyone thought the worst. The world had gone upside down. We raced off to assist this stricken vehicle. I was thrown out at the patrol base, and I remember feeling quite sick at this point, running into the base, as troops raced out the other way, trying to grab their body armour and rifles, racing out to assist. Feeling very sick and totally out of my depth at this point, I climbed a sanger and did the only thing I knew I could do. And I made this little study. You see, as the vehicle I was in races out to help the stricken vehicle out of picture, it's the trail of dust, the fine dust in Afghanistan. And I remember thinking while I was doing this drawing, some locals wandered past. And it struck me how seemingly ambivalent they were to the tragedy that may have just have occurred. However, if you've lived in that sort of environment for so many years, maybe that you can only be seemingly ambivalent. News came through there were 2 casualties, but they weren't too bad. When, boom, straight in front of us, another IED went off. I was horrified. It would have made a very powerful drawing, but I couldn't do that. I didn't think it was right. I didn't make a drawing, I didn't even take a photograph. So concerned was I for the fate maybe of those inside. In fact, this is a painting made afterwards from memory, a few drawings, and a couple of photos. It's like an explosion of paint, where the paint drips down the surface and just misses the returning foot patrol. Almost an analogy to the pure fortune of it all. There were 2 casualties, and in the word of the troops, they were unlucky but lucky. On this occasion, they weren't too bad. This is a quick drawing study made of the Pedro Medivac, the American medical helicopter, with a coloured smoke that's thrown out to mark the landing spot, the HESCO walls of the base, and a watchtower. The young gunner, had been blown up twice that day, and it was his 20th birthday. the driver, who strangely I'd talked to that morning and had the adjacent bunk in the camp. They were taken away. And I remember it was quite haunting that night to see this guy's empty bunk, and already his kit had been packed, taken, and was gone. The last of the troops came into the base about 10.5 hours after being on the ground. And I remember everyone was wired, full of adrenaline. And as the sun began to drop, I climbed this sanger and made a study of the base. The troops all gathered here in the near ground by the cookhouse and smoked cigarettes, drank tea or brews and scoff, and talked over the sort of madness of the day. Now and again someone would come and join me and see what I was up to. And I began to realise that even though I'd only been in Afghanistan or in this base for a couple of days and had arrived with a paintbrush rather than a rifle, really what was going on here, it was as if, because I'd been through a similar experience, I'd been accepted, and to a degree, as much as possible, become one of them. First thing the next morning, news came through that a young captain, everyone knew, had trodden on an IED a few miles north. He was in a bad way and later died. You could feel the thoughts and the gloom in the base. Equally as an opposite, to give you a little vignette, I remember watching a household cavalry officer smoking a pipe and surveying the distant landscape. Again, a little flashback to a previous era and different time. Been decided to head back to the DC at Musa Qala in a Mastiff armoured vehicle. Travelling in a Mastiff, personally I found to be a very intense, hot and claustrophobic sort of experience. You're very removed from the outside world, and the only sort of awareness you have of that are fleeting glimpses of maybe roofs of compounds, or often just the sky through the small driver's windows up front. The only other light comes from above, the gunner's turret above. We headed off towards the DC, and usually this journey would have been quite simple. However, on this occasion, we couldn't get through. The driver cursed and reversed and tried another route. Again, we couldn't get through. More swearing, the gunner disappeared to see if he could clear the route, and again, we had to try another route. By this point, with the news of the morning, everyone in the back was getting very edgy and tense. And it was thought we were gradually being led or tunneled into Taliban positions or an ambush. Someone shouted out, "There's a spare rifle for you, George." And of course, my imagination began to work overtime. I was very grateful to be drawing at the time. In fact, I was making a portrait of this bombardier here. And again, it gave me something positive to do and think about. Of course, drawing in that situation with a vehicle bumping and jolting across the terrain was very tricky. And it was very much about, as much about the marks you didn't make as the marks you did. This painting is owned by the National Army Museum as well. And it's presently on show downstairs in the Unseen Enemy exhibition. I was trying to, in this painting, convey the intensity of being in the back of one of these vehicles. And it very much plays off the story I've just relayed where everyone is in their own thoughts and having to deal with the nerves of it all on their own. Equally, it plays off the incident with the IED, hence it's pitched to one side. And I put the light trailing from the gun turret above almost as a sort of reference to Renaissance paintings and the element of spirituality. Almost as if inside this metal box you're resigned to your fate and there's nothing else you can do. Poignantly, the last piece I made in Afghanistan was made in Kandahar of a staff sergeant attached to the household cavalry. Whilst painting him, a large blast went off outside, followed by a firefight. Abruptly, we had to cease working as sirens rang out, reminiscent of the Second World War, and don our helmets and body armour. I did return to this study, although briefly, before we had to move. And somehow, to me, it captures something of the reality and tragedy of war. And I was later to learn a British soldier had been killed in that blast. Now, Paul Nash, the renowned First World War artist, describing his experiences following the First World War, wrote, "The struggles of a war artist without a war." Again, referring to the World War I, he wrote, "It sounds absurd, but life has a greater meaning here and a new zest. And beauty is more poignant." Now, in no way would I consider myself or compare myself to Paul Nash or either his experiences in the trenches of the First World War. But what I did understand here was the sort of sentiments he was writing about. Because in Afghanistan, I had lived and experienced and lived life with a sort of heightened sense of awareness, surrounded by the constant and perpetual dangers. And it had given life a real sense of meaning and purpose for the first time. And it was almost like a spiritual experience for me. Returning to the UK was a real anticlimax. It was very grey and dull. And I began to understand what it must be like for a soldier returning to civilian life after 20 years in the army. I attended various parades. This is Trooping of the Colour, and a medals ceremony at Windsor for the household cavalry. I met up with a lot of the troops that I knew and got to know them better. I met their wives, their families, their girlfriends. And I began to understand military life back in the UK, almost in reverse. This is one of the remembrance ceremony for the brigade, and in fact, the disbanding of the brigade. I spent many hours painting Sean Fry in his lifeguard's attire. I'd wanted to paint someone I'd seen in action in Afghanistan in their desert fatigues as an opposite in their ceremonial attire. This portrait was a deliberate play on the grand tradition of the Victorian hero. And in fact, Sean Fry had been a hero. He'd been awarded a military cross in 2006 for actions of gallantry in Afghanistan. Equally, my portrait was a bit subversive. Usually, a portrait like this would be of a high-ranking officer, a colonel, a general. Sean Fry, when I first met him, was a squadron corporal major, or the equivalent of a company sergeant major. I went to his wedding in Windsor and attended his 40th birthday bash at the sergeant's mess. where I learnt to do a bit of hardcore drinking. All these experiences, of course, I noted all the time in my sketchbooks, gave me a perspective on my work in Afghanistan. I spent the next year and a half creating a large body of paintings, reflecting my vivid experiences. These were exhibited at Bonhams in London and Edinburgh, and through the sale of many works, we collected a considerable sum for the charity Combat Stress. Really, in the journey of an artist, I realized that my return from Afghanistan was really just the beginning. Thank you.